you're going to have to bear with me. I've read this through a few times and hadn't made it yet. Before I read it, I want to say that, just very shortly, I'm thankful that Mitchell had that man right there as a friend for almost 50 years. You couldn't ask for a more quality friend to have yourself tied to. I'm going to read this. This is, I'm going to read word for word from Mitchell. It says, first off, I'd like to thank Pam for letting my brother Mike get up here and say a few words for me. Mitchell said, word for word, brother. I said, okay. Whatever you want. John and I have been best friends for almost 50 years, having met when we moved to Leggett Drive in 1970. We were almost not allowed to be friends, according to the story Miss Graham tells. Told him one morning, years ago in Bolivar. I'd taken a motorcycle ride down the coast through Bolivar early one morning, rode by the Graham house. Miss Graham was sitting on the porch swing when I pulled up, so I got off the bike and sat with her for a bit. She invited me up for breakfast, and we talked for quite a while she told me a story of when me and John had first met. John invited me to spend the weekend up in Chester, Texas, where they had a place. And sometime during that weekend, Miss Graham said she came outside on the porch and heard us talking around the corner of the house. She told me that the language coming out of my mouth would have made a sailor blush. And that she didn't think it'd be a good idea for us to be friends. So about a week later, Miss Graham gets a card in the mail thanking her for inviting me to spend the weekend with them. She told me she knew that letter came from my mom. And with a mom that sweet, there might be hope for me after all. I'm sure glad she changed her mind, because John and I have been best friends ever since. Speaking of motorcycle rides, John had a mini bike that we used to ride all over Bolivar when we were kids. We couldn't ride on the road, so John knew all the trails and paths to get to wherever we wanted to go, which included cutting through people's yards. Yeah, we're bad for that. One day he was cutting across some people's backyards, ran into a low-hanging clothesline, about chest high with no clothes on it. That thing snatched us right off that mini bike, and the bike kept going. I guess the throttle got stuck because we chased it until it ran into a house. Thank goodness no one was home, but it made a lot of racket running into that house. I remember that story. Then there's that time John was hauling me around on handlebars with a 10-speed bike, and his big white dog got after us around the corner of Mechanico. We'd always been able to outrun that dog before, but today it was gaining on us, and John was giving it all he had, standing up on the pedals, everything he could do. We're both looking back at that dog, and bam, we ran right in the back of a parked mail truck. You should have seen us climbing under that mail truck to get away from that dog. Man, it's remembering him telling these stories. It seems that all my memories have John and the Grahams in them. From growing up as a kid to junior high, high school, and adult, we stayed close. When John started his own family with Pam, we stayed close. His kids were like nieces and nephews to me. They even called me Uncle Mitch, and I was just as proud of them as he was. John loved his family more than anything, and rarely would you see him without one of the kids in tow. Then his kids started having kids, and of course John loved them with all his heart as well, taking on the name Pa Dad because his oldest grandson and youngest son were so close to age. Not too many people that mean much to me as John does. He's been right there beside me during my best times and in my worst times. I'll never forget calling him from Freeport that night to tell him that Raymond had fallen overboard. Oh, man. While we were coming in from fishing, and I didn't know where he was. Sure not, I'm not sure which call was the hardest one I made to the Arena family, or the one I made to John. John was down there within a few hours with a note. And Troy to help us. To help us look for him. I blamed myself for years, and John would tell me, it's just Raymond's time to go. They were best friends too, and knowing that they are together now brings me some peace. John was a great friend with quite a few GP boys because he had that big old heart. He never had to guess where he stood. With John, if he was your friend, you knew it, and he'd do anything for you. I can count the times when John and Pam lived around the corner on 18th Street and I need help with something around the house. Here'd come John to the rescue, or many times I'd call him on Sunday afternoon to see what they were doing. He'd say nothing. I'd ask him, well, what do I need for gumbo or something else he felt like cooking. He'd tell me to go to Middleton's, get what he needed, and spend the afternoon hanging out around the pool, cooking and having a few beers while we swam. Then it was time I entered the chili cook-off at Connie's House out on Highway 90. If y'all know Mitchell, you know this line is true. I don't know the first thing about cooking. And John had something to do that day, but he drove all the way out there from GP first thing in the morning to get that chili going for me. When he left, it was a huge pot of chili covered in foil. All I had to do was stir it every now and then. There were 10 other teams in that competition, and I ended up winning first. Which gave me 2 trophies, one for the cook, one for the assistant cook. Now you'll understand Mitchell in this one. I kept the cook trophy. Gave me the assistant cook trophy to this pretty little girl I was sweet on at the time who hadn't stirred a few times. Oh, that's Mitchell. When John found out I gave his trophy away, he just shook his head and he said, man, you ain't right. John was always the biggest boy on the block, he was, but was always the most even-tempered of all of us. I never saw him angry. I remember having a party for my dive school graduation class, invited all my classmates along with a few friends from GP. Everybody got along for the most part, but a few of my classmates were a little high-strung and had to be put in check. This one guy got cross with John and squared off with him. I remember thinking, here we go. And stepped back to watch the show when John tells him, boy, I've been in 10 fights, I've thrown 10 punches, and you're fixed to make it 11. My classmate looked at him, just shook his head, walked off. These memories from years ago, but as recent as last January, I was home on R&R, as y'all know Mitchell works in Iraq, when I got a letter from the HOA complaining about mildew on my siding that needed to be cleaned off. That's also Mitchell. You know, I had every intention of cleaning it off myself, but ran out of time. So once more, I called John and asked if he could get his boys to come help out do the job. Of course, he said yes. There's absolutely nothing John wouldn't do for a friend, and I learned how to be a friend from John. I just hope I can continue to be the friend to others that John was in me. Everything seemed to change with that phone call from Jake telling me his dad had passed. I've lost many people I cared about, more than my feelings shared sometime, and I gained a lot of coping skills to this, but none of them seem to work now. I just try to think about all the great times we had over the many years and know that he wouldn't want me or any of us to grieve for him, at least not for too long. This much I know for truth. John, you will live on for many decades, perhaps even centuries with your stories being told every time your friends and families get together. American by birth, Texan by the grace of God. Mitchell Dean Lamb.